So this was my original title. Okay, really the theme is how to, your soil, since soil takes a long time to change, but plants change a lot quicker, how can we use plants to maybe turn the soil into what we want? So really, some buzzwords that you hear a lot now are like regenerative agriculture and stuff, but really what that is just applying ecological principles to an agriculture application. And that's, something that I've been doing with soil survey my whole career, and as a range management specialist, really have been a student of for a long time. This talk will be a little heavy on soil science concepts, but really I bring that up not because I want to turn all of you into soil scientists, although that would be cool, but I'm going to bring it back to what does that mean for the plants, okay? Like that's what we're thinking about, is how are we examining these soil characteristics for the plants, okay? Okay, I am going to talk about what soil survey is. Have you guys heard of soil survey before? Anybody? You've heard of it. Okay, a few people here. So what that is, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history, because I think it's important to understand the context that it comes from and kind of where we're going, and that we're really at an interesting place now to expand soil survey into areas that it wasn't before, where to find the soil survey information. And then we're going to talk about this concept of soil health, which really is just how do you use plants to change the soil? That's all it is. And then I want to talk about how the work that I do specifically connects back to the soil survey, which is what plants would we expect to find on those soils? And then you can also use that sort of information to kind of figure out what plant species you would like to grow in your area. I'm not even reading my notes, so I hope that it's going well. So what is soil survey? This is the very formal definition, but it's just really, it's based on the principles of soil science, physical geography, the analysis of vegetation, land use patterns, and it has elements of geology, geomorphology, and hydrology incorporated into it. And for most of the history of soil survey, we've focused on describing the static properties of soil. So that's stuff that doesn't change rapidly, like depth, color, texture, parent material. Nationally, we have over 100 years of soil survey history in the United States, and there's really an increasing awareness on what we call dynamic soil properties, which I'm going to talk more about later. But that's really what is important when you're trying to figure out why your garden's not growing, or why this really special perennial you planted isn't doing well. And then this in the green box is a mathematical equation to represent soil formation, and it was published by a Swiss-born pedologist named Hans Jenny in 1941. And I just put it on here because it still holds up today, and we still use this same equation in the foundations of all the questions we ask. So what this says is soil is a function of climate, organisms, relief, parent material, and time. And so organisms are plants and animals. So from the very beginning, we've considered that soil really is influenced by the vegetation. It's a feedback. So because I'm going to talk about soil scientists, I want to just take a moment to talk about some of these more jargony terms. So you've dug a hole probably, and you've noticed different layers of soil, right? One's easy to dig through. That might be sandy or loamy. One is hard. In the middle of summer, you get to something super hard. It's like, is this rock? Well, it could just be super dry clay. Anyway, these are called soil horizons. And the horizons are defined as distinct layers of soil that are parallel or nearly parallel to the soil surface. And what makes them different is their physical or chemical or biological characteristics differ from the layer above them. So like this example here, the C horizon has bigger, larger rock fragments than the B horizon. The B horizon has more roots than the C horizon. Obviously, that is a very beautiful artist rendering, but this is how it's really important when you think about how roots are interacting in the soil and how water is interacting in the soil, is how thick are those layers and what is the composition of those layers. And then all of the layers together is called the soil profile. So if you hear a soil scientist or you're reading a document, they're talking about horizons and profiles, that's what they're talking about. Okay. The first soil survey was conducted in 1899. It was funded by the Agriculture Appropriations Act of 1896. And really the focus was on farmed regions. And then between 1900 and 1930, soil science really started to become its distinct discipline that was separate from geology. And then in response to the Dust Bowl, FDR created this what was called the Soil Erosion Service. And then that later became the Soil Conservation Service. And there was led by a gentleman named Hugh Hammond Bennett, who really, he guided the Soil Conservation Service through the Depression years, and the focus shifted from soil survey to soil conservation. And so that's like the historical foundation that the agency that I work for comes from, is teaching farmers to plow on the contour and planting windrows and preventing soil erosion. He's known as the father of soil conservation. And after the Dust Bowl days, he really continued that legacy of conservation, and by the 1940s had established soil conservation districts in most places in the United States. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with soil conservation districts. And then from there till like the early 1950s, soil survey was done by a variety of agencies and university partners, and everybody was kind of doing their own thing. And then it wasn't until the late 1950s that they brought it all together, or the early 1950s, they brought it all together. They called it the SCS. We were, the agency was in charge of doing soil survey as well as soil conservation. And then somewhere in the 90s, they decided that Soil Conservation Service wasn't sexy enough, and they changed the name to the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So thank you for bearing with me with the history lesson. I just think it's really important to think about kind of where we've come from on this journey and the information that you'll look at. So soil survey, great, what is that? So it used to be published in these physical manuscripts, and you could go to a conservation district office or an NRCS office and be like, I need the soil survey for my county. And it'd have lists of soil names and maps, and I'm seeing somebody nod their head like they've seen one of these before. Yeah. In the early 2000s, they kind of, I mean, I think you can still request them especially, but because we knew we were going to be updating and bringing things into a more modern time, 2005, we went to Web Soil Survey, and that's now the official repository for all soils information. And so I have the actual website, but if you just type Web Soil Survey into your Google browser, it will take you to a page that's one before the one you're looking at the screen, but it'll have a big green button that says like start here, Web Soil Survey. It's an online mapped-based interface that's updated annually. So that means all the work that every soil survey office does across the United States. And when here I'm just showing the lower 48, but we include Hawaii, Alaska, and Puerto Rico as well. And so right over here, I mean, we could do a live demo if we have time or you guys are interested later, but right over here, this is how you navigate to where you want. So if you're like fancy and you have a shapefile of your property, you could import that. But otherwise you can put your address, you can navigate by state and county. You can, if you have a latitude and longitude, you can navigate by that. You know, there are many ways to get to where you want to look at. So if you're at all curious about soils information, I really would suggest that you start here. And I wanted to show some examples of the maps and information that you can get out of soil survey. And this is, I think I have 3 examples. I mean, there are hundreds of interpretations and everything from road building to how suitable is your soil for a septic tank. I mean, we run the gamut of, as well as agriculture interpretations. So what you're looking at here is these orange lines are what we call map unit lines. And then the numbers are the map unit numbers. So you want to, you zoom into your property. This is the map unit. Just we'll pretend this is Marble Falls, but we'll pretend we were looking at 40 and you come over here. Map unit 40 is a Spicewood rock outcrop complex. It's 1 to 5% slope. So right there, all of us, none of us really know what Spicewood is, but that doesn't matter because you're thinking, well, it's not too steep, right? This land shouldn't be too steep. Okay, that tells me something. And there might be a lot of rocks around. I will talk just quickly about the scale at which soil surveys are made. The scale between like 1 to 12,000 and 1 to 24,000. So if anybody here is familiar with like a USGS quad sheet, that's a scale of 1 to 24,000 for reference. So if you zoom all the way into your quarter acre, a little warning label is going to pop up and it'll say, this information may not be accurate at this scale. That's not necessarily true, but it's just that the soil survey is not designed to be used at that scale. Does that make sense? Like they're just, if you get that warning, I don't want you to be like, she talked to us for 45 minutes about nothing. They're just trying to tell you that, the scale is intended to be a little bit larger. And conversely, if you tried to look at all the soil map units across the United States, that wouldn't work either, because that's not the right scale. Okay, so what suitabilities and limitations are how we refer to, what can the soil be used for? So this is a thematic map that has the interpretation that I pulled up here was soil salinization. And you guys have probably heard of soil salinization. This is a big problem in agriculture settings around the world, really. And so what we're looking at here is an example of surface salt concentration based on the soil survey. So salts like sodium and calcium and potassium naturally occur. They weather from the parent material. And if you're in a landscape position where these excess salts may be concentrated due to downward movement from precipitation or even upward movement from groundwater, you run the risk of getting soil salinization issues on the surface. And so at a small scale, it might not be that big of an issue, but if you're, if you even had like an acre garden that was in a soil that risked this, you could run into some big problems. So good news, most of Marble Falls has low risk for surface salinization. And so they've just got 3 categories here. And I don't know if anybody was over here looking at this, but this is an example of the different types of interpretations that are available. So land management, military, recreation, I mean, lots of things. You could spend a whole day in here if you wanted to look around. You can look at vegetative productivity, wildlife management. I really focused on these soil health ones for this talk. This one I thought was interesting because it kind of shows that those same soils that are not at risk for soil salinization have a low rating for a garden or composting facility, farm or garden composting facility. And what this is ranking on is that they're shallow to bedrock and they have a high content of stones and boulders. They might flood. They might have a water table. And then some of these over here, right? Remember I said this one was only slopes 1 to 5. I don't remember what this one was. It could have a high slope and low precipitation. So you're going to have some additional inputs here, right? And you're not going to be putting any large composting facility under the ground because the bedrock's probably down there about 1 foot. You're lucky, you said? Yeah, so you're not surprised to see this big red blob here. Okay. We also have soil chemical properties in the soil survey. So what you're looking at here is pH and the surface horizon. And so pH, as you guys all know, is just a measure of acidity or alkalinity. And you can see that this is really in that sort of, neutral to moderately alkaline range. So suitable. You're not way up there above 9, and you're not way down there below 4 or 5. Yeah, I'm not strongly alkaline. Does that make sense for where it is? Okay. Very strongly alkaline. Yeah. So the light blue, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but this color, I can't tell which one of those light blue ones it is, but okay. All right. So I've kind of talked about the history of soil survey, where it came from, all the things that you can currently find. Now, where is it going? The soil survey is really expanding because the customers of soil survey are changing. It's not just engineers and large ag producers. Now we have a lot of people in urban populations that are interested in, everything from just understanding something like heavy metals or pollution in the soils to growing urban gardens. So this is a little bit old. This is on the screen, you see the annual rate of urban development from 82 to 97. But I took this from what was called the NRCS Urban Soils Planner. And so if any of you guys live in a more urban area, it might be worth checking that out. I have the link up there, but if you Googled NRCS Urban Soils Planner, you should be able to find it. And so according to the 2010 census, 81% of the nation's population lived in urban areas. And many urban places have expanded into areas that were previously mapped. So the soils information that exists, which might be your neighborhood, it's been modified so much that the existing information really isn't correct. And you would need like an on-site investigation to really figure out what you have. So the prototype urban soil survey project started in Staten Island in 1997, but it's really been expanding, and they really focus on providing non-farm interpretations and using technology like ground penetrating radar to find out what is down there. Very interesting. I'm sure, as all of you can tell, Texas is experiencing massive population growth. So this is something, I know they have like a pilot project in San Antonio right now, but this is something that will be coming more urban soil survey. And I'm not an expert on this, but I definitely, if you're interested, check out the Urban Soils Primer. The other kind of area that we're going is subaqueous soil survey. So this is what you're looking at here is our kind of what we used to do. And you notice the map unit lines on the left-hand side of the screen do not go in the water, in the bays there. And then you see on the right-hand side, the map unit lines are now in there. And what that is they're mapping coastal zones, dunes, marshes, beaches, and shallow subtidal soils that either grow subaquatic vegetation or have the potential to grow subaquatic vegetation. And this is really important for aquaculture, oyster beds, beach replenishment, blue carbon storage. I mean, just a variety of things. Okay, I've talked a ton about soil survey. I promise I'm going to talk more about the using the plants, but I really wanted to provide a good foundation. I wanted to give you guys a break and ask if there's any questions or comments before I keep going. You don't have to, but I thought I would take a drink of water and yeah.
But you get down the soil information comes down to such small plot. How do you get that soil information? You collect it, so.
How do we collect it?
Yeah. Go out and make sample, get sample.
Yeah. For 100 years, we've been going out and digging holes and filling them back in.
But acre even. No, look up.
Yeah, 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 it's I'd like to think about making soil survey, and then as well as the work I do, which is layering the plants on top of that, is like an art and a science combined. And so you go out and collect data and then look at patterns. So sure, you dig a hole, but then you remember what was the landform where I dug that hole, what was the aspect, what was growing there, and what did I find, and how can I extrapolate that pattern? So that is where the real strict academics don't love our product, because we don't have a hole everywhere, right? Just one, yeah. Not every 10 steps. Yeah, it's really about trying to identify those patterns at a scale that's useful for management. Yeah, great question. Okay.
Erin, there was another question from the audience. Is spicewood rock a local designation or a general term?
Oh, great question. Okay, I spared you guys this information. Spicewood is the name of the soil. So soils are classified according to what is called soil taxonomy. Again, I spared you guys all this stuff. So there's this big old long name like shallow, I can't even think of one right now. Everybody's heard of the soil orders: mollisols, iridosols, inceptisols, all these things. Okay, so it gets super complicated and they have this big taxonomy thing. And so what Soil Survey has done is, instead of having a 12-word name, they just call it spicewood, or they just call it Houston black, or they call it MacGyvey, or they call it after their favorite horse when they were a kid, or they spell some landform name wrong, or whatever. It probably does, because a lot of times the local soil survey parties named the soils in a county or group of counties after local, is it a settlement or? Okay, so it probably was. Yep. But we could, if you guys are interested, we could look that. I could go into a little bit more about that, but I thought I was talking enough about soil science. I didn't want to get into how they name the soils. Okay. Healthy soil. Okay, no more to the stuff you guys are probably more interested in. So healthy soil just really means is like, will it support the vegetation that's growing there? Is there enough nutrients? Is there enough water in wet cycles and dry cycles? Is it not eroding down slope? Does it have beneficial soil organisms and not too many pathogens? It's a really broad term, but if we start to unpack what's referred to as soil health, it boils down to the principles, these 4 principles. And these are generally written for large-scale farming operations, but I'm going to talk about today how they absolutely can be applied to your backyard or your small farm to create healthy soil. And really the goal is you have less inputs, but you're maximizing output. So you're spending less time, less money, like on fertilizer and stuff like that, less irrigation, hopefully, but you're getting the maximum amount of output that soil is capable of. So, I guess I should have read them. Sorry. So they are, do not disturb the soil. So I know you have to do it a little bit, but minimize the number of times you rototill your soil. And I'm going to get into why that's important. And in a farm setting, large farm setting, they have no-till and strip-till, etc. Keep the soil covered. So that's compost or mulch or plant residue or whatever, but you just don't want to leave bare soil exposed. Keep live roots in the soil as many days as possible. That means crop rotation or cover crops, or mixing annuals and perennials, or mixing cool season and warm season. And then maximizing diversity, biodiversity. That could be some of those things I just talked about, right? Cool season, warm season, different life forms. You have shrubs and grasses and annuals and perennials. It could also be including legumes, which have nitrogen fixing bacteria in their roots. And that's a really important soil nutrient. It could also be incorporating chickens or some other sort of small livestock, your goats that'll just break into your garden and eat all your spinach. Okay, so the first one is I'm going to talk about vegetative cover. This is a really important ecological principle when we're talking about how is the ecosystem functioning, and it applies to two principles of soil health. And these are easily applied to your backyard or your farm scale. So the first one is, I tried to depict in these, I'm not an artist, I'm a scientist. I tried to depict up here in these color images. And what this is keeping a live root in the soil and how that contributes to increased soil moisture. So if you can see, the more time, so it's raining, the water's running, every time it hits a root, it has a direct channel to go down into the soil profile. Where over here, it might hit a rock, it might come down, but if you have less cover, that water is just going to stay for the most part right on the surface, and it's just going to keep going. And that concept is called like surface roughness. As you're slowing that water down, it has more time to infiltrate. And that's even true, or especially true, I should say, on a slope. So if you have a really flat field, or garden plot, it's probably going to stay there and infiltrate in an hour or whatever. But on a slope, it doesn't have time. So you really want to keep live roots in the soil and increase your soil roughness. So it slows the runoff and increases infiltration. Now, what I have up here is a really simplified representation of this relationship, because there's also a certain amount of root turnover every year with perennial plants that increases soil organic matter, and soil organic matter also helps store moisture. So it's benefiting the soil on multiple levels. Now, the second kind of big soil health idea that vegetative cover contributes to is protection of the soil surface. And this is down here in these black and white images that I took from Redmond, a published paper, Redmond 2000. And it's like the concept to think about with this is just like an umbrella. The umbrella protects whatever's underneath of it. So even dead leaves or plant residue will help to protect the soil from raindrop impact. And you can see the picture on the left, what is happening at a really small scale when you have unprotected bare soil being hit by raindrops, you're getting erosion every time. So raindrop energy is really the plant material helps to dissipate that raindrop energy, and then you're not creating soil erosion every time it rains. Okay, so like I said, we're going to bring this back to the backyard. I want you guys to look at these two kind of, I don't know, you could call it just like a little sloping area on the side of your yard, and two different kind of ways that they might respond to a rain event. And so soil health, we've been talking about these principles of soil health. It's really strongly connected to something that I mentioned earlier called dynamic soil properties. And dynamic soil properties are kind of what they sound like. They're the soil properties that change rapidly, especially in response to management. So if you rototill your garden, you're affecting your dynamic soil properties. They change naturally as well. But the interesting thing to talk about is that they change in response to management. And so dynamic soil properties tell you if your soil is functioning and how you would expect it to be changing, which is really an important connection, because if the changes are caused by your management and the management's impacting function, by recognizing these properties, you can start to make the connection between, okay, well, maybe I need to do something else to improve these properties, to improve my soil function, to get the plant response that I want. And so we'll come back to this example in just a second. I'm sure you guys have lots to say about it, but we're going to talk about this South Dakota example. And so this, of course, is like a large scale kind of agriculture application, but the fence on the left and the right of the fence line, we're comparing two types of management on the same soil. And what they did here is they looked at infiltration rates and measured the amount of time it took 1 inch of water to infiltrate. And so the left-hand side of the screen is strip till. Show of hands, strip till is like, yeah, it's like they're just tilling where they're putting the seeds, basically. So it's what they call reduced till over conventional tillage. Versus the other side is native grasses, and it's grazed. And so you can see that the strip till, it took 116 minutes for 1 inch of water to infiltrate. And then the native grasses, it took 46 minutes. So 30 minutes is a lot of time for water to just go off site, be blown away by the wind, run downstream, whatever. And so if we go back to this picture, you can compare these pictures, think about what happens, the principles of soil health, and what happens when infiltration is reduced and what could happen here. And so if you cover the soil, if you keep a live root in the soil year round, and maximize your diversity and minimize your disturbance, which not really sure minimizing your disturbance applies in this one, but the other three do, you can see you have a much different response to maybe a rain event here. Okay. Yeah. I didn't promise I wouldn't talk about soil science anymore, right? Because this is more about soil science, and this is I'm going to be quick introduction to soil structure. And soil structure I think it's a really important soil science concept that might not be that well known, but by show of hands, I've heard of soil structure. A couple, okay, good. So a lot of us understand that drainage is related to soil texture, but it's also related to soil structure. And soil structure is a dynamic soil property, where soil texture is something that is static and it doesn't change that much over time, over the human lifetime. So the image on the left is what's generally depicted as healthy soil versus unhealthy soil or degraded soil. And the healthy soil has better structure, meaning the soil particles are sticking together into these blocky shaped soil beds, they call them. It has better infiltration, water storage, and it's also, you can imagine, much easier for roots to grow in that. Where over here, you've got less structure. The soil particles aren't sticking together as well. It's harder for water to infiltrate. It doesn't store water, and it's much harder for roots to infiltrate. And and you can see there's some other things that are like associated generally with healthy soil that contribute to good structure. So organic matter is one of the things that helps structure stick together, or the soil stick together. And then on the left-hand side of the screen, you can think of granular. This is like really where these images really depict like how it relates to water storage and drainage. So in granular, you can think of that as something like beach sand. Everything that touches the surface is going to infiltrate, but it's also not going to stay there. And then blocky structure, it's going to infiltrate really well. And it's also going to have the right amount of water available for plants throughout the year. And so if you think of your mother or your grandmother's garden, and they had this perfect loam soil, what they probably also had was excellent soil structure. Sure, the texture was great, but they had been adding compost and growing a diversity of crops there for many, many years. They probably had excellent soil structure. It was dark in color. And when you dug it up, there was a big clump that stuck together. Now, it wasn't so hard that you couldn't break it. You could probably break it with your hands. That's really good soil structure. And then platy, obviously not something that you would consider that you'd want to grow plants in. You can think of that as something like a driveway or a road. Basically, the soil particles are compacted. They're really close together. Very little water infiltrates, and what does is more likely to be lost to evapotranspiration than it is to be stored in the soil. So I mentioned organic matter. So organic matter is that glue that helps really keep the soil structure together. It's produced by soil organisms. They're called polysaccharides. It's produced by plant roots. I mentioned that earlier, that a certain amount of plant roots turn over every year. That's why it's important to have perennials, as well as burrowing animals, right? I think, you know, they call it, the literature says burrowing animals create channels coated with organic matter, but I think the rest of us would just call that manure. That's increasing the organic matter. And really, soils with adequate amounts of organic matter are dark, they have good structure, they have good water storage, and they're more resistant to compaction. So if you do have a practice where you might be using a small tractor or something, soils with more organic matter are going to be more resilient after you drive vehicles over them as well. So you really want to think about when you are planting or wanting to plant, do you have a soil texture problem or do you have a soil structure problem? And if you have a soil structure problem, that's something that you can really change by the way you manage. If you have a soil texture problem, that's something else, right? Because it's not, that will not change in your lifetime. The two are related, but many times your management can really affect your soil structure. Okay, so how do you get more organic matter in your soils? And this really just takes us back to those principles of soil health and applying practices like cover crops at a smaller scale. So if you use a cover crop, it keeps the soil covered. So if you're, or maybe you do winter gardening, you know, that would do the same thing, garden multiple seasons, but just really, you don't want to leave the soil surface exposed. That cover crop, the roots as they decompose, or as you, even if you leave the residue, that helps protect the surface. It increases your biodiversity. And so I found this interesting article here that I didn't have, it's not an NRCS, it was from farmers.gov blog, but it was just talking about the benefits of cover crops for both commercial farmers and urban users. So it really helps kind of scale it down, because many times we think of cover crops as something that only corn and soybean farmers are doing. But I think it's important to, like I mentioned at the beginning, regenerative ag is a really big buzzword, and I'm sure many of you saw that documentary from 2020, Kiss the Ground. There was a documentary that came out in 2020 called Kiss the Ground that was really good, but I was like, well, this is it's kind of just buzzy. They're just talking, I mean, these principles have been around for a while. So anyway, if you're interested in that, cover farmers.gov, and it was cover crops benefit both commercial farmers and urban gardeners. You should be able to find it. Google will help you, I'm sure. So what else can you do if your soil is not great? What else can I do? Reduce disturbance. My granddad used to till his garden. I would come over and he'd be like, well, I tilled it this way, but it didn't look right. So then I went back and I tilled it this way. And then he'd complain that the irrigation water would run off. And I wouldn't say anything because he didn't want to listen to what I had to say. But I was like, sir, I know why it's doing that. And if you'd stop with the rototilling, it would improve. So doing that is same for big farming operations. When they're tilling, they're destroying the soil biology, and the soil biology is super important for providing the nutrients to your plants. You want beautiful flowers and you want a big garden. Having enough soil nutrients is really important, and water storage. And so the other thing that a lot of disturbance does is it reduces your organic matter. So if you've been adding compost and adding mulch and using cover crops and you disturb it, it exposes that organic matter to the air and it is lost in oxidation instead of being left in the soil for the soil microbes to eat. So the soil microbes will eat up that carbon, they get energy from the carbon and it stays there. So I would suggest that if you're interested in amending your soil, really think about how you're managing it and reduce your disturbance and try adding plant cover and live roots throughout the year. I liked this soil. This was just kind of to recap. I took this slide from somewhere else, but I really liked the way they summarized it and the 4 principles of soil health.
What is optimized chemical input?
Not too much fertilizer. And so this is written for like a large scale, but I mean, you know, we would use fertilizer in a garden as well to minimize your disturbance. Yeah. But that gets back to that. As you're tilling, you're reducing the soil biology and those are the polysaccharides and the earthworms and all of those. You guys have maybe heard that they'll say a teaspoon of soil has more organisms than people on the planet. Now I don't know, but the idea is that soil is full of life, and by disturbing it and tilling it, you're destroying that life, and that is why you have to use a lot of fertilizer. And so that's the idea of the less inputs. And in some places, depending on your landscape or your soils, they have nitrification problems from too much nitrogen fertilizers. And, you know, so it really helps with some of that. We can come back and talk about it. I think I've belabored it enough probably. Okay, now, when Mike contacted me, he asked me a question about, okay, we're amending the soil. If you're growing something and maybe your soil in your yard isn't good enough and you go to the garden store, what do you buy? Nobody had ever asked me that question before, but I thought about it. And this is not a recommendation. It's not, I'm not recommending for what you should buy. But I thought this was really interesting information. So the top left is what our textbook description of what soil is, right? So you have mineral soil material. That's what's weathered from the parent material. You have organic matter, not that much really, even in the mollisols, in the grasslands of Central North America, you know, organic matter content of 5 or 6% is really high. And as you go west, we have less than 1% organic matter in places like the arid shrubs, deserts of the West. And then water also is, you know, equal parts water and air. But when you start thinking about when you're buying soil, okay, you'll see bags or maybe a garden, a landscaping shop will have a big pile of something they call topsoil. What's topsoil? Topsoil is basically defined as the top 12 inches of soil. That varies a lot. What did you say earlier? You have less than 12 inches to rock, right? Yeah. So the top 12 inches of soil harvested from where? We don't know. It varies greatly. So hopefully they harvest it from somewhere that has a lot of organic matter, but basically you're not sure what you're going to get. It's going to be very similar to what we would call soil. It just the chemical composition and the nutrients, you're not going to know. And then you might find something called potting soil, right? We've all got this. I was very intrigued to find out that potting soil has no soil in it. I didn't know. She's not in her head. Like, yeah. It's just bark, moss, pine bark, and something for drainage. So don't put that into your garden. It's not really going to help you. And then if you buy something, it'll loosen it up. Yeah, I guess if you need drainage, but yeah, I mean, your compost is going to do the same thing though. And then if you buy something called garden soil, it's typically a mix of topsoil or some dirt and more organic matter. So this It's specifically designed for in-ground planting and water retention. So hence the organic matter. So the theme is more organic matter. So I thought that was a very interesting question. I learned something making that slide.
In general, what's your recommendation?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, and get the garden soil. Also, at the same time you're doing that, though, think about how you're managing it, how you're disturbing it. Are you using cover crops? Are you adding compost? Are you keeping the soil surface covered? Because this organic matter isn't going to be there 2 seasons later if you're tilling and leaving it exposed and all of that.
Let's just remember, we're lazy. You know, we native plants to make things easy. Remember to say compost happens. Compost is the key for us poor folks in this country. Don't lose sight of that. So be spending all this money when compost, and the microbial activity, that all of this stuff allows us to happen. That is the key for us surviving down in the hill country. I can speak when I put in flower beds 20 years ago, when I put good 2 inches, 3 inches of dillo dirt, K-mud compost. And basically it's been never fertilized it. And, we throw mulch on top of it. And, a couple of years later, you threw some more compost on it, but you really didn't need to. So compost, let's not make this too complicated on us.
Yeah. Organic matter and
Organic cover.
Yeah. And really, to your question about the compost can be your cover. So when we were talking about let me go back to this one, maximizing soil cover. So that can be live plants, but it can also just be like adding mulch or compost to the surface.
Yeah, there's many different kinds of compost, and I've been using cottonburr, but you can't get it very easily here.
Right.
Does it matter if you mix different kinds of compost? The soil, let's say.
Yeah. I mean, so I think what you're asking is there's going to be different nutritive components, right? And I don't know specifically. And then that's also going to, I'm not trying to he said, make it simple. But it's going to, what is in your soil already, right? What does your soil need? So it might make a difference. And if you've done some, sampling, I know like A&M does it, or you can buy those kits that can kind of give you an idea of what your soil nutrients is. That might really help you decide which type of compost is best for you, right? But of course, I'm sure all of you guys make your own compost, right? No, he's laughing. No? You have to water it. No, that's true. Not that much. I will say though, this is just a side note. So I lived in Nevada for like 20 years and I would compost, and my compost never did anything. And I would try to water it, but I came here, I water it when I remember, and it actually turns into compost just because the climate is so much different here. So you have to water it, but you don't have to water it as much as if you lived somewhere else. Okay, I'm going to talk about plants a little bit. So ecological sites. This is really the work that I do. I'm a range management specialist and a forester by training. And I've just worked with the soil survey for a really long time. And so we develop ecological sites. They are a vegetation classification system that is based on soil survey. So if you're interested in knowing okay, maybe you have a few acres, what are the native plants that are supposed to be growing here? It's just covered in Eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana, and I want to know what used to be here. This is where you can kind of get this information. You go to web soil, it's connected to web soil survey. So that whole thing I told you earlier, I did put the link on here, but it's best if you want the spatial application to go through Web Soil Survey. And so I used the Bramberger Ranch for these maps just because conceptually it's easier to understand less developed land when you're talking about this than the city. And again, this is an interpretive map of ecological sites from Web Soil Survey. So each map unit is coded as a different color to represent a different ecological site. But never fear, we recognize that there are multiple plant communities that occur within these polygons, but for visualization purposes, they just kind of pick the most common one. And so you can see that the most common ecological sites here, they down there in the right-hand corner, soil rating polygons, and they have the colors that correspond. But basically the most common in this area are Adobe 29 to 35 PZ and steep Adobe 29 to 35 PZ. Okay.
Are generally these maps based on both?
Yeah, so they're
Could you repeat?
generally are these maps based on topos, and yes, the topo maps are used when we're making the map unit delineations, because many times we're looking at slope breaks. But then we also incorporate things like geology maps and those kind of things as well. And I use the image underlay. If you, I probably shouldn't say that. I don't know. There might be an option when you're working with that map interface to actually have a topo behind it, if that's something that you're interested in. I don't know that for sure. So somebody asked about the spicewood. Oh, it was online. They asked about the spicewood name. So Adobe is another interesting name, but this one I asked about, and I was like, why is this ecological site named Adobe? And so I asked the guy in my office who's been a soil scientist in Texas for almost 50 years, and he said, it probably has something to do with the bedrock in this area, which is soft and high in calcium carbonate, and it has a really good loamy or clay loam texture that's almost perfect for making adobe bricks. So that was new information to me. Most ecological sites are named gravelly loam, or, we use these soil terms. So I thought that was very interesting. Okay. So I mentioned that we recognize multiple plant communities and multiple soils in each polygon. And so you can see, so again, the same map units, and then the numbers represent the map units, and then you go over to the legend, and all the way on the right-hand side, it has the ecological site, and those are hyperlinks. So once you zoom into the area you want, you can click on that and it'll take you to what I'm going to show you next. And you can see that the Adobe on the map unit number 6, it's correlated to the bracket soil, and it represents around 85% of the map unit. And then there's these other soils with other representative plant communities in that polygon as well. So map unit 6 is the green one, and then Adobe isn't called out specifically. It's just the most common in map unit 6, but I'm gonna talk about what the characteristics are. And so you can read them. So the ecological site tells you about the plants, but really, what are the abiotic or non-living characteristics of that landscape that support those plants? And that's what's repetitive, right? Because you might have a fire or a drought, and those plants are gone next year, or they are gone for a little while. But the landscape and the climate and the soils are going to be there a long time. So those are the groups that we make when we start talking about what are the abiotic characteristics that support this plant community. We think about things like landscape, soils, and climate. So this is the Adobe, and what I have here is called a state and transition model. And they can be extremely complex. This one's kind of simple. And there's probably not, I don't think simple or complex is one's better than the other. It depends on what you're using it for. So in the reference state, this Adobe site supported a tall grass savanna with live oak and Texas red oak. And then what can happen as you can go to different states. So the vegetation might look very different due to lack of fire. So you can see this arrow to the number 2 is the absence of disturbance, which is probably no fire over time. And then these oak trees and juniper trees just naturally reproduce. So you might have a wall of trees. Doesn't mean it's a different ecological site. It means the ecological potential has changed. And so here's steep Adobe, and I included a picture here for fun. So you can see what the representative of Adobe, pretty low sloping. Then you get steep Adobe, it's that hillside. So the vegetation and the bedrock are similar, but you have a different land use potential because of that slope. You can still have a juniper oak invasion. There's a lot more information. These documents are like 40 pages long. And different people are interested in different parts of them. And we could look at some if you want, but the other interesting part is there's plant lists in them. And so based on where you are, if you have more native soil in your area, you what were the plants that are adapted to these soils and these climate and this climate and this landscape. And so this is just a little example of some of the forbs that grow on the Adobe 29 to 35 PZ. And so what they are not is an exhaustive botanical list of every possible plant. That's not what they are. Like the lady in the back asked the question about how do you make these maps go everywhere? Because of that, they're not a list of everything. They are the list of like the most common of things you would expect to see there. And they're what they are is a really good source of information about native vegetation that's adapted to your area. If you're maybe have access to seeds. I know native seed increasing is coming a lot more common, like more people are talking about that. So I think, we're all gonna have more access to seeds soon. And I've gone way over my time, but I'm at the end. Many landowners use A&M to get soils information, and they do more like laboratory testing. And the question was, do we use or do we share data with A&M and the NRCS soil survey? I think to a certain extent, I don't know exactly, but what I like to kind of use as an example, like the soil survey is going to tell you like what the texture and the depth and the horizon, how the horizons are changing. But A&M lab testing is really going to tell you more about that nutritive. You have this much nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, and that can change drastically, even on the same soil based on management.
Yes.
So I think I talked a little bit about how like soil surveys changing, we're starting to pivot away from only looking at those static properties and think a lot more about how are we providing this sort of other information that people want. How much organic matters in my soil, how much nitrogen, how much potassium, how much phosphorus. And that's a really good source of information that already exists, even though it's a point in time. And again, those things change ephemerally. So the comment was that there is some evidence out there that using non-natives in your garden, either probably flowers mostly or ornamental, can actually have an effect on your soil. And so they change the pH or the nutritive content of the soil and make it harder for the natives to grow there. And that's absolutely true. And I'm sure it happens at multiple scales, right? And so the other thing you think about with non-natives is like, are they super prolific seed producers? And then are they going to become invasive, right? And that's another really big issue. A lot of ornamentals, I'm sure you all could come up with examples here, but I like in California, there's these like beautiful flowering shrubs they plant on the highways that are super invasive and they like take over ag fields and stuff. And it's like, oh no, they only belong on the highway borrow pit. They can't go anywhere else. I'm sorry, the question was, I have this weed, this pennywort weed. Should I pull it out or should I leave it because it has roots? if you can stop it from producing, leaving all the seeds there, if you can collect the seeds, leave the roots. But, you know, it's that your risk versus your benefit. So if you know that that stuff is super aggressive and it takes over everything, I wouldn't leave it. I would work on something else, maybe something that you can harvest and eat. Like, you know, like purslane is a weed, but it's edible and it's, you know, it's not that bad. Yeah, and it's a native, but I mean, it can be pretty weedy, but it's also edible. So, it depends. I think also maybe annuals. Well, it really just depends. Is it a winter perennial and it only comes up when nothing else is growing? Maybe it doesn't matter.